Why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about what's been happening to wages in recent years?
Yeah, so there's a longstanding question among labor economists about why wages have been stagnant, a issue that has now lasted for several business cycles. So normally economists would expect there to be a decline in wages, or at least a slowing in the growth rate of wages when there's a recession, and then there's sort of a catch-up period during the boom that follows a recession in which wages grow faster than average and kind of bring the whole economy back, such that the share of total income that goes to workers is more or less constant over time. So even as the economy grows, there's sort of an equal division of the pie among the owners of labor and capital over time, and consequently the total absolute amount that's going to workers would be rising over time as the economy gets larger. What has been going on now since 2000 at least is that the share of the pie that goes to workers has been in decline, and it's been in decline in a very specific way. That share of the pie declines when there has been a recession, as there was in 2000, 2001, and then again in the Great Recession starting in 2008, and then it's basically flat during the resulting recovery, during the recovery that follows the recession. And that is the phenomenon that I think is getting increasing attention from labor economists, because it cannot be explained by any of the data, by any of the observables that economists would typically think of as causing long-run changes in wages for individuals and for the economy as a whole. And notably, that would be education. So the view among economists is that what determines how much individual workers get over the course of their lives is what their skills are, and you can tell what their skills are from their level of education and their level of experience in the labor market. And increasingly, education is just not a very good way of discerning who gets what in the labor market. We had already known this before my paper came out about monopsony specifically, because there's an increasing inequality in inter-firm earnings among workers, and what that means is that the company that you work for matters more in determining your wages than it previously did. So rather than it be your own qualities, your own data that's like education and race or gender that is relevant to knowing what your total income is. Matters more who you work for and their position in the economy and their position vis-a-vis workers. So I think that had already kind of primed the economics scholarly community to look for explanations for who gets what that are at odds with kind of received wisdom, at least as it's existed for the last couple of decades in economics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff in what you just said, and so let's unpack it a little bit. But let me first just go back to what you were saying near the beginning, which is, that in recessions, what we've seen in the last couple of recessions is that the share of the overall economic activity that's going to wages has been declines, and that's sort of normal in recessions. But then what's been really unusual is that in the recovery periods, workers are not seeing their wages go up. And I think most people who are listening will recognize that problem maybe in their own lives. What's really striking right now is, I think, if I read this correctly, unemployment is now at a 17-year low. I mean, we would expect, am I wrong, in that kind of condition that we're experiencing right now, wouldn't we expect wages to really be being pushed right up? I mean, if there's that much demand for work overall, that would have this effect on wages, but we're really not seeing that. And what signs of growth we are seeing in wages are kind of tepid. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely a puzzle that results from, well, if unemployment is so low, why aren't workers kind of getting cut in on the deal, so to speak? I want to kind of drill down directly to one of the statements that you just made, which is the reason why unemployment is low is because demand for labor is high. And I think that's the thing that economists would typically have assumed when unemployment is low, that is because demand for labor is high. But that is potentially one of the mechanisms that is sort of broken in the economy. I think one of the causes of measured low unemployment is that a lot of people have left the workforce, and that you can see that in both at sort of younger ages, people spending more time in school, people going back to school, people getting credentialized, and also at older ages, people sort of finding ways to take what amounts to early retirement or taking early retirement as opposed to waiting for sort of full retirement. All of those mechanisms are kind of eating away at the labor force from both ends of the age distribution. And even in the middle, you see people exiting the labor force kind of for good and becoming discouraged. I think that matters a great deal for whether, to what extent monopsony is kind of the ultimate cause of these problems, because monopsony is a problem that would cause firms to demand fewer workers, and thus lower wages for the workers that they already have. And that could sort of macro level exactly be at the heart of these issues of, well, why has labor force participation seemingly declined among workers at kind of every level of the labor market life cycle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've got an opioid crisis out there, and
right.
People dying earlier than they used to. So I think that sort of feeds into maybe part of this despair and being outside of the job market that you're talking to. It's all kind of wrapped up maybe together. So you used a word a couple of times now, monopsony. Now, most people are like wondering, are you misspeaking? Did you mean monopoly? Because that's a word people know. But what is monopsony?
So monopsony is like monopoly, except it's when the power is held on the buyer side of any market. So you could have a monopsony in, say, the market for agricultural products, as I think we probably do have. It's especially important in the labor context because the view is that in general, workers are have less power in the labor market than do employers. And certainly the findings that we have in our paper would seem to suggest that, as does the findings on inter-firm earnings inequality, and lots of other types of evidence point in the direction of widespread monopsony power in labor. So what that means in the kind of nerdiest context is that employers have power to set wages. In the standard competitive model of the economy, individual firms do not have the power to either set prices in the market for their output, so that's monopoly, nor do they have power to set wages in the markets for one of their inputs, which is labor. They just go to the market, and if they need a new worker, the market sets the price for that worker. When there's monopsony power, firms' decisions change because they affect the wages that all of their workers make when they decide to employ or not employ a worker at the margin. So in the sort of most orthodox model of labor market monopsony, firms will choose to hire fewer workers than they do in a competitive labor market because of the effect that hiring fewer workers has on the price, on the wage they pay to all of their workers. And that's kind of the fundamental story that's going on, not just in our paper, but in all of the kind of theoretical work about, why would we think that monopsony would have an effect on all of these labor market outcomes we've been talking about, not just wages, but also people exiting the labor force. As you pointed out, the opioid crisis, lots of sort of what I would consider labor market pathologies can potentially be explained by widespread monopsony power.
Mm-hmm. Labor market pathologies. That's a new phrase I haven't heard before. So a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with monopsony in the context more that we've talked about it on this show before, where a company is so powerful that it can set the price that it pays for a certain input. So we've talked about this, like, for example, in agriculture, where farmers are trying to sell, their hogs or their chickens, and the processing industry is so concentrated into a few hands that those companies basically can say, we're not going to pay you very much, and you have no competition. And this is kind of the same thing, but it's about wages and that what workers can get in the marketplace. So you've done, together with a couple of other economists, Jose Azar and Ioana Marinescu, have done a couple of studies that really delve into this and have been getting a lot of attention. And I want to talk a little bit about the first one that you did, which came out back in December. And I'll say to listeners, you can go to the show page for this episode, and we'll post links to these studies and to the New York Times article and everything else. And you'll find the show page at ilsr.org. But just starting with that first study, one of the most visually arresting maps I've seen in a while is in that study. And it's this map of the United States broken up, I think, by county. And It's a measure of how concentrated the labor market is in each county. That is the notion that if you're in a particular occupation, there may only be one or two, three companies within your commuting distance that you could apply to for work, that it's a highly concentrated market. And so you use red to show extremely concentrated, and most of the map is red. And then, some other parts of it are orange and yellow, which are highly and moderately concentrated. That's pretty much the rest of it, orange, yellow, and red. And then there are a few islands of green. Those are unconcentrated markets, but they're very few. It's Minneapolis, Denver, Boston, Miami. It's mostly cities. And then just surrounded by this sea of highly concentrated labor markets. Tell us a little bit about what's behind this map. What kinds of occupations are you looking at? What does this really mean?
Yeah, so the data set that we worked on in that first paper is from the online job matching company Career Builder, and basically employers would pay to post a job ad on that website, and then would-be applicants can see it just as they would have in the olden days gone to classified advertising in the newspaper and submit a application via the website for that job, and that's a fairly rich data set relative to the data sets that most labor economists are used to, because you can see at least some information about both employers and employees. So the kind of classical labor economics that I was referring to before, where you study education, race, and gender, that's because mostly for workers, you just see things about the worker and maybe, and also what they get paid, but you don't see anything about their firm. Here, at least, we do see which firms are posting vacancies and where they're located. And we can thereby create the map that you're just referring to. So what we did was look at the occupations that arise most frequently in this database. So I think it's 20 most frequently appearing occupations, and we define the labor market as the vacancies that are posted for those occupations within a given commuting zone in a given quarter. So that is an important concept, market definition, especially if you're doing antitrust type analysis to see whether the market is concentrated or unconcentrated and to what extent. And we think that market definition is not necessarily exactly the right market definition in every single case, but it is small c conservative in the sense that when workers are looking for a job, they tend to look for jobs that they think they would have some chance of getting. And if you look at the occupation level that we look at, it's actually wider than the set of jobs that workers would think they have some chance of getting, looking at that data set from the perspective of which jobs do the workers actually apply to. So we're including more job vacancy postings in our market definition than we think are really relevant to individual workers who are looking for a job. So that would tend to underestimate the degree of concentration in that labor market. And yet we still find the results that you refer to, which is that labor markets tend to be highly concentrated. One last thing to note about how that chart is created, how that map is created, is, this whole data set is about job vacancy postings. Insofar as economists have studied labor market concentration at all before, it tends to be the concentration of employment and not the concentration of vacancies. And I think it is correct to look at the concentration of vacancies if you can, as opposed to the concentration of employment, which generally easier to get data on the concentration of employment, because what's really relevant to workers who are looking for a job is how many firms are actually hiring. And again, going back to the idea of pathologies of the labor market, one thing that we observe in this era of slack labor markets is that workers tend to stay in the same jobs for longer because they themselves cannot move up the job ladder, as is the sort of metaphor that economists typically use. And the flip side of workers staying in the same job for longer and not moving up the job ladder is that any given job is vacated less frequently. So even if, say there's a number of people currently working as a farm equipment mechanic in the area of Wisconsin where Matt Gee's works, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are vacant jobs in that area that he could potentially apply to. And that's why I think we show a finding that caught a lot of people's attention, because they tend to think like, oh, well, every firm, maybe not every firm has a farm equipment mechanic, but every firm, has administrators and secretaries, and certainly it seems like the healthcare sector employs a lot of people. So you would think that, say, the market for nurses is relatively unconcentrated, but no, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are jobs available for people in all of these different occupations, especially not for people who are looking for a job. I think there are many fewer options to be had, and that's why the finding of concentrated labor market seems to ring so true with people.